is about Today, the bay is about 20,000 acres in extent, and the area in blue is where the tides migrate up to on a daily basis. The yellow line that you can see is the 1870 shoreline that was that I just showed you previously. So let's see that. And going forward, looking at 2060, 2065, when it's projected that we could have a meter of sea level rise. The area in blue is what would be tidally inundated. And again, you can see the yellow boundary, which was the shoreline boundary in 1870. So in just another 40 or 45 years, the bay will greatly expand to about 31,000 acres. Right now, it's about 20,000 acres. And historically, it was about 26,000 acres. So the bay is undergoing some very dramatic changes, and so we'll explore why those changes are occurring and what they might mean to our region. So basically, why are sea levels rising? It's all about greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, there's a very tight relationship between global temperature, land-based ice, and sea levels. As global temperatures go up, land-based ice melts, the water runs into the ocean, sea levels rise. When global temperatures drop, we have snow accumulation on land, and we expand the land-based ice storage, and sea level rises dropped. So until we bring greenhouse gases emissions under control and stop warming the planet, we are going to continue to have sea level rise. And that's just the plain fact. How fast the sea level rise will occur and how high it will occur will depend on how severe the greenhouse gas emissions are, and what we're able to do probably in the next 40 to 50, 60 years. There's been some recent projections on the greenhouse gas emissions and its relationship to global temperatures. If we continue just the way we are with the greenhouse gas current policies, we could see probably upwards of 3 degrees centigrade of increase in global temperature above where we are now. The global temperature we have now is causing the ice, land-based ice, to melt and sea levels to rise. So that will not stop if we continue our current policies. Even if we can reach the Paris Accord and reduce our greenhouse emissions and only have 1.5 degrees Celsius in temperature increase, that's still a 1.5 degrees warmer than what it is today. So we're going to continue to have sea level rise for the foreseeable future. Some recent studies in Antarctica realized that there's a major tipping point that's coming up in probably about 40 years. By 2060, we could have a catastrophic crossing of a threshold where the ice that's melting in Antarctica won't stop it won't be reversible in human timescales. And we've been with the civilizations living on a stable shoreline for the last 6,000 years. So we're really coming across a major threshold in just 40 years to get greenhouse gas emissions reduced. 2060 coincides with another threshold on Humboldt Bay that between now and then, if we are not able to slow sea level rise down based on our current emissions, it doesn't look likely. The bay will cross a threshold and we'll see a major expansion in the bay's inundation footprint. So when we look at sea level rise, it's good to look local rather than global or regionally. The ocean off the west coast, is rising through thermal expansion and some sea level rise contribution. But what is really important when you're looking at local sea level rise is what is the ground doing? And on Humboldt Bay, we have tectonic subsidence occurring because we're at what's called the triple junction with the Cascadia subduction zone, the Gorda Plate, the North American and Pacific plates all merging together off of Cape Mendocino. And because the ground is dropping, the ocean the eustatic sea level change is about 8 inches for the last century. But on Humboldt Bay, what's been measured at the North Spit tide gauge, we've had about 18 inches of sea level rise. It's the highest rate of sea level rise on the entire West Coast, and it's because the ground is subsiding due to tectonic activity. Coincidentally, the area that has the lowest amount of sea level rise is Crescent City. And again, it's because of tectonic activity. the land at Crescent City is being pushed up with the Cascadia subduction zone. The Pacific plate going under the North American plate is pushing up the North American plate. Crescent City's on the North American plate, so it's going up. And so it has the lowest rate of sea level rise on the entire West Coast. So the two extremes are side by side, and it's because of the geology. And when we look at sea level rise projections, there was projections issued by the state in 2010, 2013, and 2018. When we look at what was projected by 2100 back in 2010, we were looking at planning for about 4 feet. And in 2013, that jumped up to almost 5 feet. Now we're being told to plan for about 7.5 feet. Every time the state does a newer assessment on the rate of sea level rise, you can see it continues to increase. And so and the state sea level rise guidance is what we use, and they were just released in 2018. Fortunately, there was a number of us locally that provided input on the state's draft sea level rise guidance document, and we strongly requested that they create a table of sea level rise projection for every tide gauge on California, and particularly our tide gauge on Humboldt Bay. What they had been doing in the past was just picking three representative tide gauge. And for the North Coast, they would pick Crescent City, which shows no sea level rise. So they were saying we were having no sea level rise on Humboldt Bay, when in fact we have the highest rate of sea level rise. Now the state's guidance document is actually issued with projections for the North Spit tide gauge. So we're getting good guidance from the state. But if we look at the trends as, what's the highest tide measured every year, and we plot that out for the last 40 some odd years, you can see that there's a clear rise in the annual high tide on Humboldt Bay that we've been measuring. And so I think that this is a really good document to show that things are changing, over the long term, at least over 40 years. And we're having king tides. I mean, every winter, the Humboldt Bay Keepers has a king tide photo initiative, encouraging people to get out and photograph it and see what it looks like. This is up at Liscom Slough off of Mad River Slough. Here's Freshwater Slough up for Eureka Slough. Here's down on Martin Slough on Elk River. Here's Fields Landing, the boat launch of Fields Landing going uphill because of a king tide. And then King Salmon is definitely a place that experiences king tides pretty regularly. And so, and then more recently, we've been observing areas flooding. This is the wildlife refuge on Fay Slough, and the tides have not overtopped the shoreline. The flooding that we're seeing is the king tide pushing up the groundwater until the groundwater emerges and floods all the fields. So this is actually the more significant and incipient impact from sea level rise, is emerging groundwater flooding. But we do have incidents when king tide overtops shorelines and starts flooding agricultural fields. So when we look at flooding and flood hazards, especially in a tidal environment, it's good to look at the frequency of flooding. If something is flooded on a daily basis by mean high or high water, that's perennial flooding. If it's only flooded on a monthly basis, maybe for several hours on any given day, that's chronic flooding. It causes a lot of problems. It needs to be addressed. We need to do something to mitigate that. If we have flooding on a once a year basis, such as king tides, it's more considered a nuisance than it is of something that we can live with. It's a short-term effect. So when we talk about tidal and sea level rise inundation, we look at, we'll first start noticing it as king tides, then we'll notice it more frequently on a monthly basis, then we'll notice the flooding on a daily basis when things will essentially convert into tidewater. In New Year's Eve on 2005, we had a king tide and an extreme water event. The water reached an elevation of 9.6 feet. It was the highest water elevation recorded at the North Spit tide gauge, and the governor declared a state of disaster. 9.6 feet is only about, it's little less than a foot. It's about 8/10 of a foot higher than our monthly or our annual high tide. Our annual high tide is 8.8 feet. And this extreme water event that resulted in a state of disaster was 9.6 feet, less than 1 foot of sea level rise. There's not a lot of sea room on Humboldt Bay to accommodate sea level rise before we're having a state of disaster. And when we look at these projections, if 9.6 feet equals a state of disaster. Right now, even our annual high water doesn't reach that level. It's only 8.8 feet. But with 1 foot of sea level rise projected by 2030, our annual high water, our king tides, would exceed that state of disaster. By 2045, we're projected to have 2 feet of sea level rise. And by then, not only would the king tides exceed the state of disaster, but our monthly high tides would be exceeding the state of disaster. By 2060 or 65, when we're projected to have 3 feet of sea level rise, the daily high tide would exceed the state of disaster or equal the state of disaster. And so we really only have 40 years and only can accommodate 3 feet of sea level rise, and we'll be living in a daily state of disaster. So for us, that's a good marker to keep track of what areas will be impacted and how long we have to react. And so moving on, this is Humboldt Bay out in a minus tide in the middle of the summer when the mudflats are greened over with algae, and you wouldn't really know you're out in the middle of the center of Humboldt Bay, but it's kind of an unusual feature I thought I would share. One of the first sea level rise studies on Humboldt Bay I did back in 2013 to 2015. In the shoreline on Humboldt Bay, or the shoreline anywhere, is really the front line when it comes to sea level rise. And so the shoreline of Humboldt Bay hadn't really been mapped since 1870. So I proposed that we go out and map the shoreline and figure out how vulnerable the shoreline is based on what it's made of. And what we found when we mapped the shoreline, it's 102 miles in length, is 75% of the shoreline is an artificial structure. Only 25% is natural. And when we look at the type of structures, we mapped whether they were dikes. Dikes are the dominant shoreline structure. It was about 41 miles. Railroad grades are the second most dominant structure of about 12 miles. But there's also roads and bulkworks and fortifications. So we created a map of the shoreline, and you can zoom in any location on Humboldt Bay. This is Eureka Slough. And the yellow areas are where the dikes are. The green is natural area. The red is railroad grades. And so we have these maps available if you want to use these. The other thing we looked at was the shoreline exposed? Was it fortified? Was it vegetated? And we mapped that distribution. A fortified shoreline is rocked, or it could be concrete rubble. An exposed shoreline is something that hasn't been maintained and has been eaten away by wave action. And a vegetated shoreline is also a shoreline that hasn't been maintained. It's been totally overgrown. You can't drive equipment out there to maintain the shoreline. And so again, we mapped the distribution of where erosion was occurring, where the shoreline was fortified. The next thing that we looked at in the shoreline exercise was what's the elevation of the shoreline. So we created a shoreline profile. And what we found is that with measuring based on the daily and monthly high tide and the annual high tide, how many miles of shoreline would be overtopped. And essentially with the annual high or the annual high tide or the king tide, there's about 7 to 8 miles of shoreline that can be overtopped with 1 foot of sea level rise or 2 feet of sea level rise. If you measure it based on the monthly basis, we have upwards of 20 miles of sea level rise or shoreline that can be overtopped. With 3 feet of sea level rise, there's more than 23 additional miles of artificial shoreline that would be overtopped. So that 2 to 3 feet is a big change. And so we mapped out where are the shoreline segments. The areas in red are would be overtopped with 2 feet of sea level rise. The areas in yellow would be overtopped with are in yellow with 3 feet of sea level rise. And then so we combined those shoreline areas that are eroding and those shoreline areas that would be over top of 2 feet of sea level rise. And we rated those shorelines as highly vulnerable. And as you can see, the areas in red, there's 59 miles of shoreline. Almost 60% of the shoreline is vulnerable at this point in its current conditions. And we mapped out that vulnerability around the entire shoreline if you wanted to know what areas were vulnerable. So the, again, one of the things about the shoreline is that the shorelines radically changed on Humboldt Bay starting around 1890. There was a big land speculation for agricultural purposes, and people started diking off the salt marsh. They would float a dredge, they would dig a ditch, pile up all the mud into a berm that became a dike right at the edge of the salt marsh next to the mud flat. And they started this in 1890, and they were basically done by about 1920 for the entire bay. And they took salt marsh that looked like this, and this is the Eureka Slough bottomland from 1870. You can see all the tidal channels traversing the salt marsh plain. And over time, with diking and clearing, we simplified the landscape so that all we were left with is 3 tidal channels and no salt marsh. All the salt marsh was converted to agricultural land, all behind dikes. And we have dikes on Humboldt Bay today that haven't been maintained, that are actively eroding, that fill up with king tides. And when we look at the distribution of tides on a daily basis on Humboldt Bay, again, this is the Eureka Slough area down by Murrayfield Airport. The area in blue is where the tides go on a daily basis. If the dikes were to breach, and they have breached in many locations on Humboldt Bay, but if they were to breach, this is the area in Eureka Slough that would be tidally inundated on a daily basis. This isn't sea level rise. This is just the dike structures failing from being breached or overtopped. And so this is a historical legacy that was left to us from the diking starting in 1890. They cut off about 8,000 acres of salt marsh and kept the daily tides from inundating those areas. And if those dike structures aren't maintained, the bay will take back those 8,000 acres that were taken away from it. And when we look at the amount of miles of shoreline that would be overtopped with 2 feet of sea level rise, it's about 11 miles of shoreline, dike shoreline would be overtopped with 2 feet of sea level rise. That could occur by 2045. 3 feet of sea level rise, and all of a sudden now we have 23 miles of dike shoreline that are overtopped. It's a big jump that occurs between 2 and 3 feet. Every diked hydrologic subunit would be compromised going from 2 to 3 feet in sea level rise. And when we look at the distribution, the image on the left shows you in red those areas that would be overtopped with 2 feet of sea level rise. And the image on the right shows you how it jumps and covers much, much more area when we go to 3 feet of sea level rise. And so this is a major tipping point that we have on Humboldt Bay that we could reach by 2060. And when you look at the distribution of historical salt marsh, you look on the left, this is the salt marsh in gold that was mapped in 1870. If the dikes breach today, the area on the right, or the map on the right, shows you what it would convert to. The area in dark brown is mudflat, and the area in gold is salt marsh. If you look at the image on the left, in 1870, it was all salt marsh, but today, due to subsidence, if that area was opened back up to tidal inundation, most of it would be converted to mudflat, not to salt marsh. So we would have a major change in habitat distribution on Humboldt Bay if the dikes were to breach. We won't just get salt marsh back. There's another historical legacy that I want to talk to you about that's rather significant. Starting around the 1890s, the Army Corps of Engineers built the jetties at the entrance of Humboldt Bay. And when they built these rock jetties going out into the ocean, what they ended up doing was funneling all the wave energy between the jetties. So the waves got higher, and all that wave energy came running in across the bay and ran into the shoreline directly across from the jetties. And starting in 1890 up to about 1950, that shoreline retreated back about almost 1,500 feet in 60 years. It eroded back and ate away the land. And this is what the bluffs or the cliffs looked like around 1950. From all of that erosion. And they finally, some fortifications or rock riprapping was put at the base to try to stop the erosion that was occurring from the wave energy. funneling through the jetties. And so this is what's called Booner Point, or what's left of Booner Point. And today, PG&E maintains the rock revetment and those exposed bluffs. You can't really see them now because there's alders growing up and there's some trees growing on the top of the bluffs. But during king tides, the waves go over the top of the fortifications and are rolling up against those bluffs. This is a relatively new phenomena that started occurring over the last 10 years or so. But the thing that's really significant is that here's the rock fortification, here's the base of the bluff. And right here in these little dots are nuclear fuel storage silos that PG&E, when they decommissioned the Humboldt Bay nuclear power plant, they stored all the nuclear fuel rods in these silos on what was left of Booner Hill. And it's about 44 feet above water elevation, so they thought that was relatively protected. But it's only 115 feet back from the bluff. And remember the earlier slide, this is the highest rate of erosion on all of Humboldt Bay. It eroded almost 1,500 feet in 60 years before they put the rock riprapping up. If sea level rise overtops that rock riprap, it would be up against that bluff, and it could easily migrate 115 feet in a year or so. And we don't know how long those nuclear fuel rods are going to stay here. So this is what that area would look like. Here's the nuclear fuel rods. Here's the bluff. This is all that would be left of the PG&E property with 1.5 meters of sea level rise. This could occur by 2085. Essentially, it'll be an island. This is 101 Humboldt Hill. Even 101 will be underwater. They would have to build a causeway out to the island to maintain the spent nuclear fuel site. So this is the other historical legacy that we have that we really need to be paying attention to. So let's move on to another. We've gotten through the historical legacies and the shoreline conditions. Let's look at sea level rise. And so sea level rise really, when you're planning for sea level rise, you do vulnerability assessments and you come up with adaptation plans. And you're really dealing with assets that are exposed in different hydrologic areas. And you're trying to come up with a plan for what's vulnerable. This isn't new science. Hazard mitigation planning occurs every 5 years. FEMA requires it in order for local governments to qualify for pre-flood assistance to upgrade and build infrastructure. Humboldt County just updated their hazard mitigation plan in 2019, and they asked me to help them with addressing sea level rise. So in their hazard mitigation flood plan element, we looked at 3 feet of sea level rise and 8 feet of sea level rise, and they used the assessor parcel maps for the county, and they quantified how many structures, how many people would be exposed with 3 feet of sea level rise, and they found that 620 people could be exposed, 290 structures, and the development is worth about almost $400 million are at risk with 3 feet of sea level rise on Humboldt Bay. With 8 feet of sea level rise, which is what we could experience near the end of the century, 2100, it jumps up to almost 2,600 people are exposed, 1,100 structures are exposed, and the development value that would be at risk is $2.3 billion on Humboldt Bay. And this is based on current development and current values. And over the course of the century, I'm sure it'll change. But this is hazard mitigation planning that is just bringing in a new element of sea level rise as a cause of flooding instead of 100-year storm events. But when we're looking at sea level rise, what we're trying to figure out is, when is it going to occur? Where is it going to occur? How is it going to impact the areas? And what is it actually going to impact? And then for adaptation planning, we want to know who's going to do something about this, who's going to plan for this, and what is it that they can actually really do. And on Humboldt Bay, we've had local geologists and engineers that have figured out when sea level rise will occur and what areas. That was Cascadia Geosciences, the geologists that figured out how fast, and Northern Hydrology and Engineering's figured out where the sea level rise would flood. And so when we look at the areas that would be flooded, they produce flood maps or sea level rise maps. And this shows you the area that would be tidally inundated if the dikes breached on Mad River Slough, and then with 1 meter of sea level rise, which is about 3 feet, and then 2 meters, which is another 6 or 7 feet of sea level rise. And you can see initially with the dikes breaching, the major area would be flooded. That's the former salt marsh that's being reclaimed by the bay. And then with 1 meter, you get an expansion of the area that's inundated, and 2 meters, you get a slightly more expansion. So you get a slow creep. The big impact on Humboldt Bay is going to be the bay reclaiming its former tidelands when the dike structures breach. So the type of impacts that we could experience are tidal flooding and inundation from king tides, shoreline erosion from wave action. Emerging groundwater will ultimately flood all the areas behind the dikes. Stormwater flooding backs up as it runs into higher tides, and saltwater intrusion. We're already have seen tidal inundation from shoreline breaching. This is on Mad River Slough back in 2003. We have a lot of areas on Dike. It only takes a small location like this to breach, and it would flood all of the land behind the dikes. You could have, a mile or two of dikes that are flooded all from one opening if that were to a breach. On Humboldt Bay, there's I think 270 assessor parcels that make up the shoreline, and there's no centralized dike district for the entire shoreline of Humboldt Bay that's responsible for maintaining all the dikes on Humboldt Bay. It's really up to individual property owners. And so there's one small dike district who hasn't really been very active, and it's only on the north part of Arcata Bay. And dikes, really aren't the long-term solution. They hold back rising tides and wave action, but ultimately it's the emerging groundwater in response to sea level rise that's going to flood the areas that are behind protective shoreline structures. As groundwater now runs into the ocean, the groundwater usually equals where the shoreline meets the ocean. And then with sea level rise, as the water tides rise up, it'll pushes the groundwater up until it pops up and emerges in low-lying areas adjacent to the shoreline. And so they've done some mapping on Mad River Slough to identify how deep is the groundwater from the surface. This area in red shows groundwater within 0 to 3 feet, and this area is 3 to 6 feet. With 1 meter of sea level rise projected by 2060, you can see all this area in blue becomes surface water, emergent water, and the area where groundwater is less than 3 feet expands. With 2 meters of sea level rise, or 7 feet, almost all of the area now is emergent groundwater. Even if the dikes were still intact, this is where the areas would be that are vulnerable. Essentially, all the areas that were salt marsh in 1870 are vulnerable to 1 meter of sea level rise by 2065, even if we maintain the shoreline structures. And it's not just diked agricultural lands. Fields Landing is built on former salt marsh. And the residential area of Fields Landing is really low elevation. It's less than 8 feet elevation. And so with 1 meter of sea level rise, a lot of the residential area, even if the shoreline is not overtopped, rising groundwater could flood most of the residential area of Fields Landing. And when we look at, dike structures, they're essentially like dams along the shoreline. So when we have winter rainfall and stormwater runoff, all that water flows into these agricultural lands, flows down to the dikes, and is dammed up and it ponds, and it all has to drain through tide gates. And the tide gates only open when the tides drop down below mean high water. So they're only open for a few hours a day. So you can end up having backwater flooding because the rainfall can't drain through the dike structures fast enough. And we're expecting to see much more of that. And we are experiencing backwater flooding now in Fields Landing during king tides. So when you do a vulnerability assessment, you're really looking at assets, and you want to know, how are they exposed, how sensitive are they to that exposure, and how significant is that asset if it gets impaired. And so using these three milestones or viewpoints on assets, we do vulnerability assessments. Looking at exposure, if we want to know how much of the coastal zone will be exposed at different water elevations, we can map out and quantify, in the city of Eureka, 45% of an area in the coastal zone is at risk, of being inundated with king tides and different water levels. But then it's important also to identify what areas are not going to be inundated with sea level rise by the end of the century. So the level of exposure is something that you really look at. And so on Humboldt Bay, sea level rise vulnerability assessment has been going on for about the last, 6 years or so. And there's been a number of reports. One was done on the entire Humboldt Bay region, looking at agricultural lands, dike lands, in the Highway 101 infrastructure from Table Bluff to Arcata. The city of Arcata did a vulnerability assessment. I've worked on all of these projects. The city of Eureka did a vulnerability assessment in adaptation planning project. Humboldt County with their Humboldt Bay area plan, we did a sea level rise vulnerability assessment. Then we did a specialized vulnerability assessment just on the dike lands and the dike shorelines on Humboldt Bay. And then again, we did, with the county, did another specialized vulnerability assessment for communities at risk like King Salmon, Fields Landing, and Fairhaven. And we developed a strategic adaptation plan for those communities. Caltrans has been doing vulnerability, sea level rise studies on the 101 corridor between Eureka and Arcata. And they recently funded a project where the county Public Works did the study on the Eureka Slough area to figure out its vulnerability to sea level rise and develop some adaptation projects to protect the transportation infrastructure. So when we look at the type of things, a vulnerability assessment is really an inventory. What's out there? What's in the area that's going to be flooded, that's going to be impacted? And so we look at different asset classes like land uses. We certainly want to look at where communities are like King Salmon, but and we look at utility infrastructures. Where's the wastewater collection system or the municipal water lines, the natural gas lines and electrical transmission towers or optical fiber lines. We look at transportation infrastructure like highways and local roads and marine and rail to see how they're going to be impacted. Then we look at coastal resources, agricultural lands, coastal sensitive habitat, and cultural resources such as WIAT sites. And then lastly, we looked at contaminated sites. Where are contaminated sites in relationship to the areas that are going to be inundated? And with communities, King Salmon, there's no doubting that it's right at sea level rise and it's very vulnerable to any sea level. It's right at water elevation and it's very vulnerable to sea level rise. And here's the King Salmon on the left. The residential area is about 8 to 10 feet. Here's Fields Landing. The residential area is about 6 to 8 feet. And with half a meter of sea level rise, less than 2 feet, most of King Salmon and Fields Landing would be flooded on a monthly basis. And you don't know what day of the month that's going to occur. So at any day in the course of a month, you could see flooding in these areas. So these areas are really at the front line that need to be addressed first. With 3 feet of sea level rise or a meter by 2065, essentially both communities are flooded on a daily basis. King Salmon and Fields Landing would be converted to tidelands unless they're raised in elevation. And the Eureka Waterfront is also at risk. Essentially, the area west of Bayshore Drive or Broadway is what's at risk from sea level rise. So all that development, we have the Eureka Waterfront with a lot of recreational development that's at risk. We have bulk cargo docks that serve international trade. We have the bulk fuel terminal that's out on the water that brings most of our fuel. The commercial fishing fleet is centered in the Humboldt Bay port. Their fish processing facilities are in the waterfront. The Woodley Island Marina, the Eureka Marina, all of these are right at the mean sea level, right at water elevation. And so all of those areas are at risk from sea level rise. And when we look at the distribution of utility infrastructure, we have municipal water lines going across areas that are going to become tidally inundated on the Mad River Slough and Arcata Bottom. Eureka's water lines go all the way along Bayside and all the way across the Eureka Slough areas that will be tidally inundated. The areas in red are PG&E's gas lines, all of them along in areas that will be tidally inundated. And then even the electrical transmission towers going all the way across. All of that utility infrastructure is not built to deal with sea level rise. And Arcata wastewater treatment facility is out in the middle of the bay. It ultimately will need to be relocated. The city of Eureka's wastewater collection system, like out in Jacobs Avenue by Murray Field, has lift stations. Those don't operate well in saltwater if they're tidally inundated. And that area, as it shows here, would be tidally inundated. If the sewer lines are infiltrated with salt water because the pipes aren't tight fitting or they're concrete, that salt water, when it gets into the sewer lines, goes to the wastewater treatment plant, and the salt water would shut down the biological processing in the wastewater treatment plant, even if the wastewater treatment plant is not being inundated by sea level rise. Trying to repair a municipal water line like this one that the city of Eureka has out in the Eureka Slough bottom line, when you have 8 to 10 feet of tide water on a daily basis, is going to be really, really difficult to maintain these water lines. When electrical transmission lines are going across open water, it'll be a very different environment to maintain the electrical distribution. Even the PG&E power plant that we have, the new power plant we have, is at risk from sea level rise. If you look, when you drive to King Salmon, you go over a bridge that goes over that canal. That canal goes right into the center of the power plant. That would bring all of the sea level rise right into the center of the power plant. And then we have cultural resource sites that have been mapped out all the way around the bay with 1 meter of sea level rise by 2065. 37 sites could be at risk. With 2 meters before the end of the century, fully 83 sites could be at risk. And so when it comes down to it is, for transportation infrastructure, we can't afford not to maintain the fortifications. This is the abandoned railroad between King Salmon and the city of Eureka. And it's a seawall directly across from the entrance of the bay. And the waves slam in there and go over the seawall. And they're washing away the railroad ballast. Just on the other side of the railroads, only, a couple of 100 yards away, is Highway 101. And so if nobody's maintaining this fortification, 101 is at risk, and Caltrans doesn't own the shoreline. They can't fix the shoreline. And when we talk about marine transport, bulk cargo ships, fuel ships, and stuff like that, how is the jetties and the entrance of the harbor going to respond to sea level rise? The jetties will go underwater with 2 feet, 1 and 2 meters of sea level rise. Will they continue to function? Will we be able to continue to dredge the navigation channels with sea level rise? Will it change sediment transport and sediment deposition? And then, moving on from transportation infrastructure and looking at cultural resources, we have Dike's former salt marsh, which is currently grazing land. These areas are really at risk. This is the former 8,000 acres of former salt marsh. But these diked areas are also really abundant waterfowl grazing areas. And we have a lot of wildlife refuge. The Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has 3 wildlife refuges. There's local land trusts and county wildlife refuges, city wildlife refuges. These dike areas are seasonal freshwater wetlands that support a lot of waterfowl and wildlife. And so when we're looking at the conversion of coastal resources, the mudflats occur basically from mean lower water -3 foot elevation up to about 5.8 feet of elevation. Salt marsh occurs from 5.8 up to about 8 feet, another 3 feet. As water elevations go up, those mudflats and salt marshes and eelgrass will migrate inland with those rising water elevations. So the coastal habitats in the bay will change. What we see on the left is the distribution of open water, the blue, brown, which is mudflat, and gold is salt marsh. If the dikes fail today, that's what will happen. With 1/2 meter of sea level rise, as the water gets deeper, the salt marsh starts getting pushed out and is forming more of a band around the perimeter. The mudflat is expanding, but so is the eelgrass habitat. With 1 meter of sea level rise, possibly by 2065, you see the salt marsh becomes a band, the eelgrass is expanding, and before the end of the century, about 2090, even the mudflat becomes a perimeter band around Humboldt Bay, and we're having much more open water and eelgrass. So the bay, the very nature of the bay, will change with rising water elevations, just because the bay can't spread out, so the water gets deeper, and the type of habitat we have is dependent on how long it's inundated by water. So salt marsh is inundated much less than mudflats. Mudflats are inundated much less than submerged channels. So. And looking at open contaminated sites, those are known. We mapped those and tried to identify which ones would be inundated by different water elevations. Open contaminated sites are not the responsibility of the city or the county to fix up. It's really the state's responsibility and the property owner. And so there's a lot of sites that will be exposed, and we don't know who's going to treat them or address those. So here's Liscom Slough on Mad River Slough with its existing shoreline protection that's really not working during a king tide. So going forward, what's the basic principle for planning is that we can't plan based on property. You can have one property owner that fortifies their shoreline and the neighboring property doesn't. But if it breaches, as I showed you in earlier slides, all the land behind the dikes floods together. So we have to develop plans for entire water geography areas or hydrologic units. And so the county has compiled all the vulnerability sea level rise work that's been done on Humboldt Bay and repackaged it based on what are the attributes for each hydrologic unit. And there's 6 major hydrologic units and 24 hydrologic subunits. And we've identified what are the shoreline attributes for each one of these units, what the shoreline is made of, how long is it artificial, is it natural, is it dike, is it road? And we've created maps that show you where those structures are, where the tide gates are for the entire bay, that show you where the dikes are, where the railroad is, where the areas are exposed and where they're fortified. And the shoreline attributes also identify elevations for all the hydrologic units and which areas are vulnerable and how many tide gates there are. And again, we have mapping in this document that shows you where all the shoreline elevations are of less than 2 feet, 2 to 3 feet, greater than 3 feet, and the areas that are vulnerable based on our shoreline attributes. And then we've looked at what are the land uses and jurisdictions for each of these hydrologic units. So we've taken about a dozen reports and condensed it all down. Rather than describing what's going on in Arcata or Eureka or the county, we just ignore jurisdictions and we describe what's going on in Mad River Slough, Arcata Bay, or Eureka Slough. And so we have maps that show, agricultural areas, residential areas that would be tidally inundated. What part is in Eureka? What part is in the county? The area in blue is Eureka, green is the county. What part is in state retained jurisdiction? And again, for each of the hydrographic areas, we've identified how many cultural sites, how many wildlife refuge acres, how many contaminated sites, and we've mapped where all of those are and described that based on the hydrographic unit, not on the land use jurisdiction. And then near the end, we've done the same thing for the utility infrastructure. How many miles of water line, sewer line, gas line, electrical transmission towers, all of this has been mapped and broken out in tables for each of the hydrologic units. And then lastly, we've done the same for transportation infrastructure, Highway 101, local roads, bulk cargo docks. So
So,
that dock, yes,
Aldaron, we have a question from Pat that I think is relevant,
okay,
if you don't mind me interrupting really quick.
sure.
So, Pat asks, do the projections go all the way out to 2090 take into account the amount or rate of subsidence? And is that something that is considered unpredictable? I can imagine that the possibility of an earthquake would add a huge level of uncertainty.
The sea level rise projections for Humboldt Bay for the North Spit tide gauge do take in tectonic subsidence. They're based on relative sea level rise, which is what's the ground doing as well as what the sea levels are doing. So the projections are assuming that the rate of tectonic subsidence is consistent of what it was in the past, say for the last 100 years. That may not be a true assumption. It may slow down, it could speed up. We know that from the studies that have been done by Cascadia Geosciences, the rate of subsidence is higher in South Bay and lower in Arcata Bay. And so it's not uniform across Humboldt Bay. The North Spit happens to be right at the midpoint. And so if we assume that that is constant, then the projections, would hold true. With all of the every 5 years they're updating the sea level rise projections. I would imagine they would update the relative sea level rise or the tectonic subsidence to see if it's changed over the last 5 years. But if we have a Cascadia event like in 1700, it dropped, the bay dropped 3 feet in elevation. That would completely change everything, so all of our modeling and our projection would all be reset, if we have a Cascadia event. We don't know when that's going to happen. It's been 300 years, so it's probably going to happen, sooner rather than later. I think the period is between 300 and 500 years for the Cascadia event, but that's something that just hasn't been able to be modeled or factored in. And so going to the next level is what can we do to adapt to sea level rise? What can we do on Humboldt Bay? And the Coastal Commission has issued sea level rise policy guidance documents to help people do vulnerability assessments and for local cities and counties on how they can do adaptation planning. They've even come up with a specific guidance document just for residential areas like King Salmon on how to deal with those areas. And so we use those documents here locally. Right now, Humboldt County is doing a regional sea level rise planning feasibility study, trying to figure out, can we do regional sea level rise planning instead of Arcata, Eureka, and the county each doing their own and trying to merge them together with the Coastal Commission. We don't know if it's feasible. We hope that it is. Regional planning has been attempted in other areas, but usually big metropolitan areas like San Francisco, LA, San Diego. Whether it would work on a rural area like Humboldt Bay, we'll have to see, but it's really the best way to do planning for sea level rise. But one of the complications we have on Humboldt Bay, which is totally unique for California, is that when they created the Coastal Act back in the 70s, the state retained development jurisdiction over all tidelands that are tidally inundated on a daily basis. But they also kept jurisdiction over the former tidelands that have been diked off. And so when you look on Humboldt Bay, the area in blue shows you where all the former salt marsh areas that have been diked off, the former tidal areas. All the entire shoreline of Humboldt Bay is in the Coastal Commission's development jurisdiction. And all the area in blue, which is essentially 75% of the area that would be inundated with 1.5 meters of sea level rise between now and the end of the century, is in the state's jurisdiction for controlling development, which means controlling adaptation implementation projects. Adaptation, building new shoreline structures is a development and it's subject to the Coastal Commission's jurisdiction. This situation doesn't really exist on this scale anywhere else in California other than Humboldt Bay. So even if Eureka, Arcata, and the county got together and developed a strategy, they would have to get the Coastal Commission to agree to implementing that strategy for adaptation to sea level rise. This is really going to complicate, doing things on Humboldt Bay. But when we look at sea level rise, one of the common or recommended solutions is to come up with a sea level rise hazard zone, just like we have flood hazard zones based on a 100-year flood. The image on the right would show you a sea level rise hazard zone, say for 1 meter or 2 meters of sea level rise. And you can see it equals almost the same area that's already the FEMA 100-year flood hazard zone that the county does hazard mitigation planning on every 5 years. And so creating a sea level rise hazard zone really wouldn't be an imposition in our area because it's already an area covered by the 100-year flood hazard mitigation planning. So doing a sea level rise hazard zone is a good way to go forward with planning. But whatever we do to the shoreline is going to be subject, local jurisdiction is the harbor district, and at the state level with the Coastal Commission. Nothing can be done to change the shoreline. And remember, the shoreline is the front line of defense without these two agencies' approval. And when it comes down to the shoreline, it really comes down to who owns the shoreline. Can we get them all to agree on what to do? And is shoreline protection really the way to go in the future? This is that seawall between King Salmon and Eureka. And you can see the railroad tracks are all washed away. If we look at how you figure out what to do adaptation planning for, you could try to prioritize assets. The city of Eureka tried to do this. They looked at the exposure and the susceptibility of the asset that would be impacted, but then they wanted to look at what was the consequences of losing that asset? How critical is it to the region? And they developed a table to try to figure out what are the high priority assets in 2050 and 2100. Where should they focus their planning energy? The county did a similar thing. They looked at the 24 dike hydrologic units and tried to figure out, based on the number of assets that are protected by the dike shoreline, which are the high priority dike shoreline units of the 24. And they came up with these are the ones that should have the priority for focusing adaptation planning. And so what do you do with the dike? Here's a typical dike. It has a top crest that you can drive equipment on, has 2-to-1 slopes, has an inboard ditch and has an earthen core. Building new dikes on Humboldt Bay would cost about $2.7 million a mile. And there's 41 miles of priority dikes, 41 miles of priority dikes. I mean, the priority dikes would cost $111 million to repair. And so that's a lot of money to devote to our shoreline.
So Aldaron, we actually have a question about funding for
Uh-huh.
this kind of work from Ann Pearson.
The funding is the big question. That's the big bugaboo, is who's going to pay for it. There's a couple of legislations that are working their way through at the state level to try to come up with bond money to help buy out lands that are susceptible to sea level rise, so that people can live there until they're no longer safe, and then they can relocate or remove those developments. But it really comes down to, if we wanted to rebuild the dikes or relocate the dikes, who's going to pay for it? The city and the counties don't really have the money. The San Francisco Bay Area came up with a sea level rise property tax to raise money to help do sea level rise planning, and hopefully to do some sea level rise adaptation. But just like with the 100-year flood hazard planning, most of the money, I think it's 60 to 80% of the money comes from the federal government, and the 40 to 20% comes from local government. Something similar like that would happen. That's really the big question, is who would pay to fix anything? And so rebuilding these dikes are going to be really expensive at $2.7 million a mile. And you can rebuild a dike on the water side, but it's really hard to get a permit to put rock in tidewater. So you could rebuild an eroded dike on the backside and keep it in place. There's other ways to address shoreline erosion that are being studied right now, and they're called living shorelines. And I've been involved with some of that. And you have a dike, instead of rocking the dike, rock is expensive to bring in. What's being planned or looked at is creating salt marsh plains, where the salt marsh attenuates the wave energy instead of rocking it. Another idea that, some of us have been advocating on Humboldt Bay is to take the old dikes and to breach them and make them become barrier islands, and build a new dike inland and restore a salt marsh plain in between. But that requires the agricultural property owner to give up some land, but they get a higher dike that can provide protection for a longer period of time. And one of the ways that we came up with the barrier island concept is we looked at areas where there was old dikes that were breached and salt marsh got restored behind the dikes. And these dikes are wildlife habitat. Waterfowl use it during high tides to roost on. And so the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge took an old dike system and excavated and lowered its elevation, used that fill to build salt marsh, and left a barrier island that was breached so the tides can come in and restore the salt marsh, and this becomes wildlife habitat. Instead of bringing in rock and trying to put rock in a tidewater, which the Coastal Commission really doesn't like you to occur. In order to build living shorelines, you need to have a toe to anchor all the fill material that you bring in and put in the bay. Otherwise, it would wash away. The typical idea is to build a rock berm, but the Coastal Commission really doesn't want you putting rock in mud flats. So this barrier island concept is, we think, a hybrid way of doing a living shoreline. And so we've identified on Humboldt Bay, we've identified areas where living shoreline could be attempted, where salt marsh could be restored that eroded. And we've identified existing dike areas on Humboldt Bay where the dikes could be breached and allowed to become barrier islands, and a new dike could be built so that it protects a critical asset like Highway 101. This is the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge in South Bay. So we've identified all of these areas. But again, dikes are limited to the low-lying areas are vulnerable to emerging groundwater, even if the dike is rocked and high enough in elevation. And so,
Actually, Aldaron, sorry to
okay,
interrupt. We have another question that it seems pretty relevant to this portion of the talk. So we have a question from Pat about other green approaches to sea level rise adaptation. So is the sort of living shoreline, is that kind of the main green approach, or are there
yep,
others?
it is the main approach. The main thing for shorelines is to avoid building a seawall or rocking it. So salt marsh cuts down wave height and wave energy, and so building a shoreline plane is sort of the dominant structure. In some areas, they've tried to create cobble shorelines that would break up wave energy, but Humboldt Bay is surrounded by mudflat, not cobble, so it's not a viable technique. Oyster reefs have been thought of as another way to break up wave energy, but our oyster reefs only go up to about 1 foot elevation, so they wouldn't be high enough to anchor the fill that would be brought in for a salt marsh plain. And so, really, what people have been trying to do is to see if they could bring in rock and build a rock berm and then fill it behind with material to create a salt marsh plain. But the Coastal Commission hasn't been going for it. So that's when I started advocating to create these barrier islands. We could excavate a ditch in the mudflat just like they did back in the 1890s and pile up the mud and create a berm out in the bay made out of mudflat. And these berms, like we've seen in South Bay, are really resistant to being eroded away. And that could become the toe, and then you could backfill it with imported fill, and you would have a salt marsh plain made out of natural materials. Those are kind of the current green infrastructure ideas that have been talked about. So it looks like I'm running out of time. We could end it here if you want, or I could continue. What would you like to do?
I think you should feel free to continue if you'd like.
Okay. So looking at king salmon, we came up with adaptation strategies of what could be done for king salmon to protect it. And so we looked at a whole host of different ideas. We thought you could build a dike around the main canal and cut off all the tributary canals so that the tide water doesn't come in the tributaries and doesn't flood all the residential areas. We thought you could raise the streets so that the streets with the rising groundwater would be above water elevation so you could still access all of the community. With increasing water elevation, we would need to elevate King Salmon Avenue so you could continue to get into it. Ultimately, put King Salmon Avenue on a causeway. We could fill in the canal that goes into the PG&E power plant right there where the bridge is. They don't use the canal anymore. That was for water cooling the nuclear plant. So we could fill that in, and that would block tide water from going into the power plant. Ultimately, we could raise Bunner Drive up in an elevation, and King Salmon would become an island, to for protecting this. And so, and for the cliffs and the barriers, we could use a dolo rock field, like the jetties are made out of those dolos to try to protect the barrier. If we look at trying to accommodate sea level rise rather than resisting it in King Salmon, there's some interesting ideas. There's areas where they've built roadways out over water bodies on causeways, and then they build residential homes tied to and they're floating on pilings. They all have their own boat docks. That is what King Salmon is all about, is waterway access. Right now in King Salmon, we have elevated living spaces where the bottom floor can afford to flood and the upper floor would still be protected. Some of the new buildings in King Salmon have breakaway lower floors, and the livable spaces on the top floor. And the elevation for the top floor, or the livable space, is higher than what the water would reach by the end of the century and a king tide. Um, it doesn't really help with how are you going to drive to the house, in a century from now with a king tide, but your livable space would be there. So those are some, you know, accommodation strategies. Relocation, there's some things that could be relocated. This is a dry dock and marine repair area and Fields Landing. As that area floods, it could be relocated to another location to continue to service, so those type of shoreline businesses could relocate. Even the Humboldt Bay power plant could be relocated. It's not water cooled anymore. It's not a nuclear power plant. It's a natural gas plant. It doesn't need to be on the shore of Humboldt Bay. It could be up on Humboldt Hill, and so some things can be relocated. But can we relocate the community of King Salmon in the community of Fields Landing? How do we move a unincorporated residential community everywhere that's suitable for community development has been development? I really think when it comes to situations like King Salmon and Fields Landing, we don't really relocate, we abandon over a slow period of time. Ultimately when these areas are so inundated that the insurance underwriters for the mortgage companies perceive these as being too vulnerable to insure, that's when, people will start leaving those areas. So, and then ultimately we need to look at where's the tide going 100 years from now. It's 2020 now. So where's king tide going to be 2120? And the yellow boundary shows you where the tide is. So if we were going to relocate anything, we would need to put it outside that yellow boundary. We can't afford to relocate things more than once. And so, and can we maintain the entrance of Humboldt Bay, with 3 feet, 10 feet of sea level rise by 2120? How do you keep an artificial entry to, what if the south spit goes totally underwater? There'd be nothing to anchor the south jetty. The north jetty will be out in open water because that part of the north spit will be underwater. Can you keep dredging a channel, when you have rising sea level rise, changing the sediment distribution and transport patterns within the bay? And then ultimately, projecting out, sea level rise is not going to stop 100 years from now in 2120. It's going to keep right on going. If this is with 2 meters of sea level rise, the high tides will come up Mad River and join the high tides coming up Mad River Slough. So Mad River and Humboldt Bay will merge. By 2120, Mad River will flow into the bay east of the Hammond Railroad Bridge. That's well east of where it is now. If we have the Mad River flowing into Humboldt Bay, it'll be bringing a lot of sediment. It'll be bringing a lot of fresh water. It could create huge salt marsh plains. It could make more of an estuary brackish water environment. The North Spit will become a series of barrier islands. But this is pointing out there's some significant major changes in the near future in Humboldt Bay. The bay is expanding and evolving. And so when you look at planning regionally, who are the stakeholders? The Wiyot tribe is really a leading stakeholder. The people that own the shorelines and the properties, the low-lying properties that are going to be tidally inundated are stakeholders. The land use authorities like the county and the cities, the regulatory agencies like the Coastal Commission, the utility services providers like PG&E and the Humboldt Community Services District, and then the transportation infrastructure people like Caltrans and Humboldt County Public Works. And then lastly, us, the public and public interest groups. All of these people should have a seat at the table in planning. So there's over 10 sea level rise projects currently underway right now. It's really, really difficult to stay on top of what's going on Humboldt Bay. And so to that end, I helped create a Sea Level Rise Institute at HSU. It's called the HSU Sea Level Rise Initiative. And if you go to their website, one of the things that we did is we took all of the documents that have been produced on Humboldt Bay, and we partnered with the HSU library, their digital commons it's called, and all the documents that have been produced on Humboldt Bay for sea level rise are in the digital commons for Humboldt Bay, and all the GIS databases are also in the digital commons. We wanted to create an institutional depository for everything that's been done and everything that will be done on Humboldt Bay, so the information doesn't get lost, so you can stay on top of what's going on and try to become involved. So that's it. And I went over by 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
No, thank you so much, Aldaron, for that talk. I really appreciate it. We have tons of questions. So
Okay.
so our first sort of set of questions have to do with how we can, so we have a question from Kyoko and another question from Tammy that are sort of both getting at how do we change sort of the politics around sea level rise adaptation so that more happens and quickly to address some of these issues. So how do we best address sort of a recurring trajectory of on the local level of maybe not moving quickly enough to address
I
sea level
think what we
rise?
need to do is we need to do regional planning. We just can't go by artificial boundaries. But the local governments need to essentially they need to hear from the public. That this is a priority, and the public. The reason why I do these presentations, I think I've done more than 200 presentations now in the last 10 years. It's to educate the public so you can express your opinions to your elected officials of what you want to see get done. My big hope is that the kids in high school, this is their future, that they become much more active, and the people in junior college and college, that they become more active locally. But ultimately, trying to push our local government into making this a priority, and to be planning for it. And we need to really lobby at the state level that we need money for this. If we don't have any money coming in, we're not going to be able to do anything as it is. I mean, local government is strapped trying to do their own capital improvement programs. Adding planning for sea level rise is just an extra burden that they can't afford.
I'll just put a quick plug in for our state legislative committee. So feel free to get involved in that. So we have a couple more questions regarding infrastructure and impacts to infrastructure. So, so we have a question from Jerry. What does this, meaning sea level rise, have to do with, like, how will this impact putting wind turbines in the bay?
Well, the wind turbines that I've heard about would be offshore. I think they're planning offshore like 20 or 30 miles. I haven't heard of anybody wanting to put wind turbines in the bay itself. As we know, they tried to put them up on Bear Ridge, and that wasn't very popular. It wasn't a very good site. And so sea level rises, as could impact the port infrastructure that supports the wind turbine construction and maintenance. Really the future of Humboldt Bay as a port. We're the main port between San Francisco and Coos Bay, and if we're going to service a wind energy farm off the coast, we need to have a functioning port. So they need to figure out how do they maintain entrance and a navigation channel. The Harbor District wants to make the wind turbine facility over there by Samoa Bridge in the town of Samoa, so they need to be able to get in and out.
Great. So I think that addresses the second question, which was about specifically the Nordic fish factory. I don't know if
The
you have
Nordic
anything.
Fish, it's being built on an old pulp mill site, and it's actually, when they built the pulp mill, they leveled the sand dunes, so it's at a pretty good elevation. It's above the projected sea level rise through 2120, but the rest of North Spit isn't. In fact, the Nordic Farms area would end up becoming an island in North Spit. The North Spit will break up it and become barrier islands. So while the Nordic plant and location wouldn't be inundated, it's going to be challenging to access it because it's going to be exposed as a barrier island.
Great. Thanks so much, Aldaron. It looks like that's all of the questions that we have.
Okay,
So,
good.
yeah.
That wasn't too bad.
Thanks everyone for your great questions and for your participation. I think with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks again, Aldaron. Thanks to our co-sponsors, and again, for all of you who are just who are new to 350 Humboldt, I'm going to drop our website in the chat so you can sign up and learn more about us. Yeah, please do reach out to us. We would love to hear from you, and let us know if there are any other speakers you'd like to see in the series. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having me.